The autumn wind whistled through the Colorado mountains as rancher Hank Morrison chopped firewood outside his remote cabin. It was October 1899, and Hank had been living alone in the wilderness for 6 years since retiring. From his job as a territorial deputy, the isolation suited him fine after decades of dealing with criminals and corruption. Hank was stacking split logs when he heard voices approaching through the pine trees. He set down his axe and listened carefully. Living alone had sharpened his senses, and he could tell these were children's voices mixed with exhaustion and fear. Through the trees came 4 boys walking slowly up the mountain trail toward his cabin. They appeared to be between 9 and 14 years old. Their clothes were worn and patched, and they moved with the careful steps of people who had been traveling for days. "Hello there, boys," Hank called out in a friendly voice. "You look like you could use some food and rest." The oldest boy stepped forward cautiously. He had dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed older than his years. "Are you Mr. Henry Morrison, sir? We have been looking for you for 3 days." Hank studied the young faces. "That depends on who is asking and why you want to find me." The boy reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made Hank's blood run cold. It was a sheriff's badge tarnished with age and stained with what looked like dried blood. "My name is Robert Chen, and I am 13 years old. This is my friend, William Santos. He is 12. That is Michael O'Brien. He is 11, and the little one is Thomas Murphy. He is 9. We found this badge, and we think it belonged to Sheriff Patterson from Silver Creek." Hank accepted the badge with trembling hands. He recognized it immediately. Sheriff James Patterson had been one of the most honest lawmen in Colorado Territory. News of his death 2 months ago had shocked everyone who knew him. "Boys, where did you find this badge, and what does it have to do with me?" Robert glanced at his companions before answering. "We found it hidden in the cellar of the Silver Creek orphanage where we lived. It was wrapped in papers that showed Sheriff Patterson was investigating something terrible before he died." William stepped forward. "The papers proved that Mayor Bradley and some other important men were stealing money that was supposed to help orphans like us. Sheriff Patterson found out about it, and they killed him to keep him quiet." Hank felt his heart sink. James Patterson had been a friend during his deputy days. The idea that the sheriff had been murdered for doing his job filled Hank with the familiar rage he remembered from his law enforcement years. Michael spoke up. "We tried to tell Deputy Morrison about what we found, but he said we were lying and threatened to send us to the Territorial Reform School. That is when we decided to run away and find you." Thomas, the youngest boy, looked up at Hank with eyes that held too much pain for someone his age. "Miss Sarah, who worked at the orphanage, told you were a good man who used to help Sheriff Patterson catch bad people. She said if anyone would believe us it would be you." Hank knelt down to the boy's eye level. "Sons, you are safe here, but I need to see those papers you mentioned. If they really prove that Sheriff Patterson was murdered, then we have serious business to discuss." Robert carefully pulled a bundle of documents from inside his shirt. He had obviously taken great care to protect them during their journey through the mountains. "These show everything Sheriff Patterson found out about the mayor and his friends." Hank unfolded the papers and began reading by the light of his oil lamp. What he discovered made his hands shake with barely controlled anger. The documents detailed a conspiracy that reached far beyond simple theft. According to Sheriff Patterson's investigation, Mayor Bradley and several prominent businessmen had been embezzling funds intended for territorial welfare programs. Money meant for orphanages, schools, and poor families was being diverted to private accounts controlled by the corrupt officials. But the conspiracy went deeper than financial crimes. The papers showed that when citizens began asking questions about missing funds, they faced harassment, intimidation, and in some cases violence. Sheriff Patterson had documented at least 5 suspicious deaths of people who had tried to expose the corruption. "Boys," Hank said, looking up from the damning evidence, "Sheriff Patterson gathered enough proof here to send these men to prison for the rest of their lives. But that also makes these documents extremely dangerous to possess." William nodded. "That is why we had to run away. We heard Mayor Bradley telling Deputy Morrison that the 4 of us needed to be sent somewhere far away, where we could not cause any more trouble." Michael added. "They were planning to send us to a place called Canyon Ridge Work Farm. Miss Sarah said boys who go there are never heard from again." Hank felt ice forming in his veins. Canyon Ridge Work Farm was rumored to be a brutal labor camp where unwanted children were worked to death under conditions that amounted to slavery. Thomas climbed onto Hank's lap, seeking comfort. "Are you going to help us, Mr. Morrison? We do not have anywhere else to go, and the bad men will keep looking for us." Hank wrapped his arms round the frightened child. "Thomas, you boys have shown more courage than most adults I know. We are going to use Sheriff Patterson's evidence to expose these criminals and make sure they face justice for what they have done." Robert looked hopeful for the first time since arriving. "How are we going to do that?" "Mayor Bradley has Sheriff Morrison and Judge Crawford working for him. They control all the law in Silver Creek." Hank was already formulating a plan. "There is a federal judge named Catherine Wells who operates out of Denver. She has jurisdiction over territorial crimes and a reputation for absolute integrity. If we can get this evidence to her, she will have the authority to investigate the entire conspiracy." William looked worried. "But Denver is over 100 miles away through mountain country that will be dangerous to travel. What if Mayor Bradley's men catch us before we get there?" Hank stood and walked to his gun cabinet. "Boys, I spent 15 years as a lawman before I came to these mountains. I know how to travel unseen, and I know how to fight when fighting becomes necessary." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their planning. Hank immediately moved to his window and counted 6 riders heading toward his cabin through the evening mist. Even at a distance he could see they were armed and riding with official authority. "Boys, we have visitors," Hank said urgently. "I recognize Deputy Morrison and several other men from Silver Creek. They are probably here looking for you." The 4 boys immediately went into action, showing survival skills they had learned through necessity. "Why?" Robert helped Thomas hide in a storage room behind the kitchen, while William and Michael concealed themselves under loose floorboards near the fireplace. Hank waited until the riders reached his porch before opening the door. Deputy Morrison stood there with 5 other men, all wearing badges and displaying the casual authority of people accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Morrison," Deputy Morrison said with false politeness, "we are looking for runaway boys from the Silver Creek orphanage. Their guardians are worried about them, and we think they might have headed this direction." Hank met the deputy's gaze steadily. "I have not seen any children. This is pretty remote country for boys to be wandering round in." Deputy Morrison stepped inside without invitation, his eyes scanning the cabin for signs of the fugitives. "These boys are more than just runaways, Morrison. They have been spreading lies about respected citizens, and they may have stolen property that does not belong to them." "What kind of property?" Hank asked, keeping his voice neutral. Deputy Morrison's expression hardened. "Documents from Mayor Bradley's office, private papers that were taken during a break-in last week. If you see these boys, you need to contact us immediately. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible Western stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat." Hank wondered how many other people the deputy had lied to in order to protect Mayor Bradley's criminal operation. "I will keep that in mind, Deputy." Deputy Morrison looked round the cabin one more time, clearly frustrated by his inability to find evidence of the boys' presence. "Just remember, Morrison, harboring fugitives is a serious crime. You would not want to find yourself on the wrong side of the law." Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe now to follow this epic western adventure and discover how Hank and the boys plan to evade Mayor Bradley's men and deliver Sheriff Patterson's evidence to federal authorities. After the deputy and his men left Hank help the boys out of their hiding places, their faces were pale with fear, but they showed remarkable determination for children who had just faced their worst nightmare. "Boys," Hank said, checking his weapons and gathering supplies, "we cannot stay here any longer. Deputy Morrison will be back with more men, and he will search more thoroughly next time. We leave for Denver at first light." Robert looked at his companions, then back at Hank. "We are ready, Mr. Morrison. Sheriff Patterson died trying to expose these criminals. We are not going to let his sacrifice be for nothing." Hank felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "Then we better make sure we succeed. We have a dangerous journey ahead, but justice for Sheriff Patterson and safety for you boys is waiting at the end of it." Hank spent the early morning hours making multiple copies of Sheriff Patterson's evidence and hiding them in various locations round his cabin. If something happened to them on the trail to Denver, at least some proof of the conspiracy would survive to expose Mayor Bradley and his accomplices. The boys proved to be remarkably organized despite their youth. Robert took charge of their few possessions, while William helped Hank prepare supplies for the dangerous journey through mountain wilderness. Michael and Thomas worked together to ready the horses, showing skills that impressed the veteran lawman. "We need to reach Copper Creek by evening," Hank explained as they prepared to leave. "There's a trading post there run by a man named Sullivan who knew Sheriff Patterson. He might be able to help us, or at least provide fresh horses." The documents they carried painted an even darker picture than Hank had initially realized. Sheriff Patterson had spent months investigating discrepancies in territorial funds, and what he discovered was corruption that reached into every level of government. Robert rode beside Hank as they made their way through hidden mountain valleys. "Mr. Morrison, what exactly did Sheriff Patterson find out about Mayor Bradley?" Hank had studied the evidence carefully during the night. "According to these papers, Robert, your mayor has been stealing money meant for orphans and poor families for over 3 years. But worse than that, he has been having people killed when they get too close to the truth." William brought his horse closer to join the conversation. "How many people do you think he has murdered?" Hank's expression was grim. Sheriff Patterson documented 6 suspicious deaths. All were people who had been asking questions about missing welfare funds or trying to organize investigations into government corruption. The list of victims included a newspaper editor who had written articles questioning the mayor's financial management. There was also a territorial auditor who had been scheduled to review Silver Creek's books. Both had died in accidents that Sheriff Patterson believed were actually murders. Michael spoke up. "Miss Sarah told us that people who complained about conditions at the orphanage sometimes just disappeared. She said she was afraid to ask too many questions because she might be next." Thomas added in his small voice. "We heard Mayor Bradley talking to some men about making problems go away permanently. We did not understand what he meant until we found Sheriff Patterson's papers." Hank felt his anger building as he thought about his murdered friend. James Patterson had been one of the finest lawmen he had ever known. The idea that corrupt politicians had killed him for doing his job filled Hank with determination to see justice done. The evidence also revealed the scope of the financial crimes. Mayor Bradley and his associates had stolen over $30,000 in territorial funds over the past 3 years. Money that should have provided food, shelter, and education for orphan children had instead been used to enrich already wealthy men. Boys, Hank said, as they rode through a particularly beautiful mountain valley. Sheriff Patterson risked his life to gather this evidence. He knew these men were dangerous, but he kept investigating because he believed someone had to speak for a people who could not protect themselves. Robert's young face showed determination that reminded Hank of his friend. "We are going to make sure everyone knows what Sheriff Patterson discovered, even if it means we have to keep running from the bad men for the rest of our lives." On the second day of travel, William, who had been watching their backtrail, returned with disturbing news. "There are riders following us, Mr. Morrison. At least 5 men, and they are gaining ground." Hank studied their pursuers through his field glasses. Deputy Morrison had apparently organized a search party and was tracking them with determination that suggests Eddie understood exactly what evidence the boys carried. "We need to reach Eagle's Nest before they catch us," Hank decided. "There are caves there where we can make a stand if necessary." The chase that followed tested both horses and riders to their limits. Hank's animals were strong and sure-footed in mountain terrain, but their pursuers knew the country well and were riding with desperate urgency. Michael called out as they climbed a steep rocky trail. "Why are they trying so hard to catch us? Can they not just say we are lying?" Hank guided his horse around a dangerous outcrop. "Michael, the documents you boys found are signed and official. They prove that Mayor Bradley and his friends are criminals. Without those papers, the bad men might be able to convince people that Sheriff Patterson's death was really an accident." The caves at Eagle's Nest provided the defensive position Hank had hoped for. He positioned the boys in a sheltered area while he took up a position that would allow him to cover the narrow trail leading to their hiding place. Deputy Morrison and 4 armed men reached the base of the rocky formation just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. The deputy's voice echoed off the stone walls as he called out to the fugitives. "Morrison, we know you have those boys up there. Send them down along with whatever they stole, and we might let you live." Hank's response was a rifle shot that sent the deputy diving for cover. The message was clear. There would be no negotiation and no surrender of the children or the evidence. The standoff continued through the night, with Morrison's men trying several times to climb the rock. Why trail only to be driven back by Hank's accurate shooting? The boys helped by rolling stones down on anyone who tried to approach their position. Thomas whispered to Hank during a lull in the fighting. "Are we going to be trapped here forever? How are we going to get Sheriff Patterson's papers to the judge?" Hank studied the terrain below, looking for escape routes. "Thomas, there is another way out of these caves, a passage that leads down the backside of the mountain. We can escape while Morrison's men are watching the front." The escape began just before dawn, when the deputy's men were tired from their all-night vigil. Hank led the boys through a narrow cave passage that emerged on the opposite side of Eagle's Nest, providing access to a trail that would take them directly toward Denver. Don't miss the next chapter of this epic Western adventure. Subscribe to our channel to follow this dangerous mission and discover whether Hank and the boys can reach Judge Wells before Mayor Bradley's corruption destroys more innocent lives. The remainder of the journey to Denver passed without major incident, though. Hank remained alert for additional pursuit. The boys showed remarkable resilience and determination despite the dangers they had faced. Robert spoke for all of them when he said, "We came too far to give up now, Mr. Morrison. Sheriff Patterson's evidence is going to save a lot of people from Mayor Bradley's crimes." Hank felt proud of these 4 remarkable children who had risked everything to honor a murdered lawman's final investigation. Their courage would ensure that James Patterson's death had not been in vain. The morning sun reflected off the windows of Denver's federal courthouse as Hank and the 4 boys approached the building where they hoped to find justice for Sheriff Patterson. Their week-long journey through dangerous mountain country had tested them all, but they had finally reached safety with the evidence intact. Judge Catherine Wells proved to be everything Hank had hoped. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who had spent her career fighting corruption. When Hank presented Sheriff Patterson's evidence, she listened with growing anger and determination. This documentation shows systematic theft and murder on a scale that demands immediate federal intervention. Judge Wells said after examining the damning papers, "Mr. Morrison, these boys have risked their lives to expose one of the largest corruption scandals in Colorado Territory." Robert stepped forward speaking for his companions. "Judge Wells, can you arrest Mayor Bradley and the other bad men before they hurt more people? There are still kids at the orphanage who do not know they're in danger." Judge Wells studied the young faces that showed such courage and determination. "Son, we are going to arrest every person mentioned in Sheriff Patterson's investigation. More than that, we are going to make sure the stolen money is returned to help the people it was meant to serve." The federal operation that followed was swift and comprehensive. Judge Wells coordinated with honest lawmen throughout Colorado to conduct simultaneous arrests of Mayor Bradley and his entire criminal network. William watched from the courthouse steps as federal marshals rode out to execute arrest warrants. How long will it take them to catch all the bad men? Judge Wells smiled at the boys' eagerness for justice. "William, the evidence you boys provided is so complete that most of these men will be in federal custody within 48 hours. They have been living comfortable lives built on stolen money and murdered innocents. That ends today." The trials that followed became the biggest news story in Colorado Territory history. Sheriff Patterson's meticulous documentation proved unshakable despite attempts by expensive lawyers to discredit the evidence. Michael testified about finding the badge and papers in the orphanage cellar. His clear, honest testimony impressed the jury and helped convict Mayor Bradley of murder, conspiracy, and embezzlement. Thomas, despite his young age, provided crucial details about conversations he had overheard between the mayor and his accomplices. The boys' memory for specific dates and names helped prosecutors establish the timeline of Sheriff Patterson's investigation and murder. Mayor Bradley was sentenced to life in prison, while his associates received lengthy terms for their roles in the conspiracy. Most importantly, the stolen funds were recovered and returned to territorial welfare programs where they could finally help the people they were meant to serve. Hank watched the verdicts with satisfaction, but also sadness for his murdered friend. Justice had been done, but James Patterson would never see the criminals he had died investigating finally brought to account. Judge Wells approached Hank after the final sentencing. "Mr. Morrison, I want you to know that Sheriff Patterson's investigation was one of the most thorough and greatest pieces of law enforcement work I have ever seen. His death was not in vain." Hank nodded, feeling the weight of 6 years of isolation finally lifting from his shoulders. "Judge Wells, these boys deserve the real credit. They risked everything to make sure James's work was not forgotten." The four boys had found new homes during their time in Denver. Federal authorities located surviving relatives for William and Michael, who were reunited with family members they had thought were lost forever. Robert and Thomas were adopted together by Judge Wells herself, who discovered that her large house felt much less empty with the sound of children's voices echoing through its halls. But the boys remained close to Hank, who had become like a father to them during their dangerous journey. His mountain cabin became a gathering place where they could visit and remember the adventure that had brought them together. Subscribe now to our channel for more epic Western stories that celebrate the triumph of good over evil. The Silver Creek Orphanage was completely reformed with new management and strict federal oversight to ensure the children in territorial care received proper treatment. A monument was erected in Sheriff Patterson's honor, bearing the inscription, "He died so that truth might live." The badge that the boys had found was mounted beside it as a reminder of how courage can speak. For those who have been silenced, Hank Morrison never returned to his completely solitary existence. Instead, he found purpose in helping other children who needed protection from corrupt adults. His reputation for integrity attracted visitors from throughout the territory who knew they could count on his help. The boys grew up to become productive citizens who never forgot the importance of standing up for justice. Robert became a federal marshal himself, while Thomas chose to become a teacher dedicated to helping orphan children receive proper education. Sheriff Patterson's investigation had exposed corruption, but more importantly, it had shown that truth could survive even when those who discovered it were murdered. The 4 boys who found his badge had ensured that his final case was solved and justice was finally served. This Western story reminds us that heroes often work in darkness and die before seeing their efforts rewarded. But truth has a way of surviving through the courage of those who refuse to let injustice win. Sometimes the most important evidence is carried by the smallest hands, and the greatest victories belong to those who never give up fighting for what is right.